Sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries come from a sound that doesn't belong. When Jedidiah Quiet Smith woke to cries of "Don't shoot, take the gold," echoing across an alpine lake, he never imagined what morning would reveal. The strange voice plagued him human words where no human should be. The old cowboy wasn't one who spooked easily, but those cries pulled at him. When he tracked the source to the lake's edge, he found no ambush or dying prospector. Just a brilliant scarlet parrot on driftwood in freezing water thousands of miles from any jungle. But what lay beneath that bird would change everything. What lost treasure had this lone, faithful bird been guarding all these years, and why? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jedidiah Smith had earned his nickname honestly. In 42 years of living, he'd spoken fewer words than most men uttered in a single season. His silence wasn't born of rudeness or simple nature. It came from a belief that most things worth saying could be said with a look, a nod, or the careful movement of a hand. The rest, he figured, was just noise filling up space between people who were afraid of what quiet might reveal. He'd been camped at Crystal Lake for 3 days now, and the solitude suited him. The alpine water sat nested in a granite bowl nearly 10,000 feet up in the Colorado Rockies, so remote that even the determined fortune seekers and railway surveyors rarely bothered with the climb. The lake stretched maybe a quarter-mile across, its surface so clear you could count stones on the bottom near the shore. Pine and spruce crowded the banks, and in the early morning, mist rose from the water like spirits reluctant to leave. Jedidiah had come up here chasing strays 3 head of cattle that had wandered from the Patterson Ranch 2 valleys over. He'd found them on the 2nd day, grazing contentedly in a meadow just south of the lake, and had spent the last day just staying. Something about this place settled him in ways the lower country never could. Up here, the air tasted clean and sharp. Up here, a man could think. His camp sat in a clearing 30 yards from the water's edge. A small fire burned in a ring of stones, coffee pot hanging from a tripod of green pine branches he'd cut and lashed together. His bedroll lay spread beneath a canvas tarp strung between 2 trees, and his horse, a patient roan mare named Bess, grazed, hobbled nearby. The 3 recovered cattle stood tied to a picket line, chewing cud and looking bored with their mountain adventure. Jedidiah was 56 years old. Though his body carried the weight of more years than that, his face was weathered dark from decades under sun and wind, lined deep around the eyes and mouth. His hair, once black as crow feathers, had gone mostly silver. He wore it long enough to touch his collar, usually tied back with a strip of leather. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who'd worked every day of his life since he was old enough to hold a rope. He'd been a lot of things over the years. Soldier, briefly, during the tail end of the war, though he'd been just a boy then, barely 15, and had seen more marching than fighting. After that came years of drifting ranch hand, Mustang breaker, freight hauler, mine guard. He'd carried a gun for wages more times than he cared to count, though he'd never shot a man who didn't have it coming. These days he worked as a ranch hand for old Tom Patterson, who owned a spread in the valley below. It was steady work, honest work, and at his age, Jedidiah appreciated steady more than exciting. The work suited him in ways the earlier jobs never had. Patterson was a fair man who paid on time and didn't ask questions about a man's past. The ranch sat high enough that winters were hard, but summers were glorious, and the work mending fence, moving cattle, breaking ice on water troughs, kept a man strong without breaking him down. Jedidiah had seen too many cowboys ruined by broncs or bad luck or whiskey, used up and cast aside before they hit 40. Patterson took care of his men, and that was worth more than higher wages somewhere else. He'd never married. Came close once, to a schoolteacher named Sarah Brennan, back when he was in his 30s, and still thought he might be the settling kind. But she'd wanted a life in town, wanted children, and a house with glass windows and neighbors close enough to borrow sugar from. Jedidiah couldn't give her that. He'd spent a whole winter working in a lumber mill in Denver, living in a boarding house, walking on wooden sidewalks every day. Nearly killed him. By spring, he'd apologized to Sarah, kissed her goodbye, and headed back to the high country. Last he'd heard, she'd married a banker and had 4 children. He hoped she was happy. He'd made his peace with being alone. The solitary life had its compensations. Nobody to answer to except himself and the animals in his care. Nobody to disappoint when he wanted to spend 3 extra days at an alpine lake just because the morning light on the water struck him as worth seeing. He'd learned over the years that some men were built for community and some were built for open country, and trying to be what you weren't just made everyone miserable. Better to accept who you were and find work that suited you than to spend your whole life trying to fit into spaces too small for your nature. The morning had started like any other. He'd woken with the first grey light of dawn, built up his fire, and set coffee to boil. The cattle were quiet, Bess was content, and the lake lay still as glass. He'd been standing there with his tin cup, watching steam rise off both the coffee and the water when the screaming started. That was the only word for it, screaming. High and shrill and desperate, the words clear even across the distance. Don't shoot, take the gold. Don't shoot, take the gold. Over and over, like a man facing his final moments and bargaining for his life. Jedidiah had dropped his cup and grabbed his rifle in one motion, a Winchester .73 he'd owned for 20 years. His heart hammered as he scanned the far shore, looking for signs of struggle, of riders, of whatever violence was unfolding. But the lake remained still. The forest stood quiet. No gunshots echoed, no horses crashed through brush. Just that terrible voice crying out from somewhere near the water. He'd moved quickly then, working his way along the shoreline, rifle ready, eyes sharp. Bess had whinnied nervously behind him, sensing his tension. The cattle had gone still. Ears forward. Even the birds had stopped singing. The voice grew louder as he approached the eastern edge of the lake, where a tumble of boulders made a natural jetty extending into the water. And that's when he'd seen it, the impossible sight that had stopped him dead in his tracks. A parrot. A brilliant scarlet parrot with wings edged in blue and gold, perched on what looked like a piece of weathered driftwood about 20 feet from shore. The bird was the size of a small chicken, its plumage so vivid it seemed to burn against the grey morning light. And from its curved black beak came that desperate human voice. Don't shoot, take the gold. Jedidiah had stood there for a full minute, just staring. He'd seen parrots before in books, and once in a travelling show that came through Leadville. But that had been a small green thing that could barely squawk its own name. This bird was magnificent and entirely wrong. Parrots lived in jungles, in hot, wet places, thousands of miles from the Rocky Mountains. Finding one here, at 10,000 feet in water so cold it would kill a man in minutes, made exactly as much sense as finding a whale in a horse trough. The bird had seen him too. It cocked its head, fixing him with one round black eye, and screamed again, "Don't shoot! Take the gold! Don't shoot!" That's when Jedidiah had noticed what the bird was perched on. Not driftwood, at least, not natural driftwood. The wood was too straight, too uniform. It was a mast, or part of one. A ship's mast, standing vertical in the water like a grave marker. His breath had caught. His mind had started working through possibilities, none of them quite making sense. A ship's mast. In an alpine lake, with a jungle bird standing guard over it. He'd looked down into the clear water then, trying to see how deep it ran, trying to understand what he was looking at. The lake bottom dropped away quickly from shore, visibility fading into blue darkness. But near where the mast stood, maybe 15 feet down, he could make out shapes, angular shapes that didn't belong to nature. That was 4 hours ago. Now, as full morning sun burned off the last of the mist, Jedidiah sat on those boulders with his coffee retrieved and refilled and studied the situation. The parrot was still there, still calling out its warning every few minutes. It seemed tireless. It also seemed determined to stay exactly where it was, which struck Jedidiah as peculiar. A wild bird would have flown off by now. This one acted like it was tethered to that mast by invisible rope. He'd pulled out an old survey map he carried in his saddlebag, one he'd acquired years ago from a geological outfit that had been mapping mineral deposits. The map showed Crystal Lake marked clearly, with notations about depth and watershed. Someone had written in the margin, in faded pencil, "Lake formed 1,875 flood check for submerged structures. 1. That would have been the Great Flood, the one that had torn through these mountains after 3 weeks of spring rain met the snowmelt all at once. Whole valleys had been scoured clean, towns washed away, people drowned in their beds. The South Platte River had risen 30 feet in some places, carrying away everything in its path, livestock, buildings, railroad bridges, and apparently at least one river barge. Jedidiah studied the mast through narrowed eyes. A river barge could have been swept up here during the flood. The drainage patterns were right. Water from the Arkansas River Valley could have poured through the passes, bringing debris with it. When the water receded and settled, it would have left this alpine bowl filled deeper than before, with whatever the flood had carried trapped beneath. The parrot screamed again, that same desperate warning. "Don't shoot! Take the gold! Take the gold!" Those words rattled around in Jedidiah's mind. They meant something. They had to. Birds learned words from people, everyone knew that. This bird had learned these specific words from someone, probably someone connected to that sunken barge. And if there was gold involved, that made this more than just an interesting curiosity. That made it significant. He thought about the stories he'd heard over the years. Campfire talk mostly, the kind of tales men told to pass time on night watch. Stories about lost Confederate gold, about treasury shipments that disappeared during the war's final days, about riverboats carrying fortune in bullion that vanished on muddy western rivers. Most of it was nonsense, he knew that. But most nonsense started with a kernel of truth. The flood had been in 75, the war had ended in 65, 10 years between. But the chaos after the war had lasted longer than the fighting itself. Plenty of gold had gone missing in those years. Plenty of men had tried to move money west, away from the occupation, away from the carpetbaggers. Some of it must have ended up in rivers. Some of it must have ended up lost. Jedidiah finished his coffee and stood. His knees protested, they always did these days, especially in cold mountain mornings, but he ignored them. He was too old to be wading into freezing alpine lakes, chasing parrots and treasure stories. He knew that. Any sensible man would pack up his camp, drive those cattle back down to Patterson's ranch, and forget the whole thing. But Jedidiah Smith, for all his years and hard-won wisdom, had never quite mastered being sensible about everything. And something about that bird, calling out its warning to empty mountains, struck him as profoundly sad, like a soldier still manning a post long after the war ended, like a promise still being kept when everyone else had forgotten. He thought about all the forgotten promises he'd seen in his life, all the good intentions that had faded when they became inconvenient, all the loyalties that had lasted only as long as they were profitable. The world was full of people who talked about honor and commitment, but abandoned both when the cost got too high. This bird, whatever its story, had apparently decided the cost didn't matter. Had decided that some promises were worth keeping even if nobody remembered making them. That kind of loyalty deserved respect, deserved, at the very least, someone trying to understand what it was protecting. He set down his cup and began unlacing his boots. The water would be cold enough to stop his heart if he wasn't careful. He'd need to move fast, get the bird, and get back to shore before the cold sapped his strength. It was foolish. It was probably dangerous. But he was going in anyway. The cold hit him like a fist to the chest. Jedidiah had expected it. He'd prepared himself mentally, stripped down to his union suit and pants, left his shirt and vest folded carefully on the rocks. But knowing cold was coming and experiencing it were two different things entirely. The water of Crystal Lake was snow-melt and spring-fed, probably no more than 40 degrees even in the height of summer. His feet went numb within seconds. He moved carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. The rocks underfoot were slick, with algae near shore, treacherous. The water rose to his knees, then his thighs, stealing warmth from his body with greedy efficiency. His breathing went shallow and quick, the body's automatic response to cold shock. He forced himself to breathe deeper, slower, staying in control. The parrot watched his approach with that unblinking black eye. It hadn't moved, hadn't flown, hadn't done anything except continue its periodic warnings. Don't shoot, take the gold. Now that he was closer, Jedidiah could see the bird more clearly. Its feathers were immaculate despite the mountain environment, still brilliant red and blue and gold. Either this bird had arrived recently, or it had found shelter somewhere nearby. Parrots weren't built for Rocky Mountain winters. 20 feet from shore felt like a mile. The cold had worked its way into his bones now, making his muscles stiff and clumsy. The water reached his waist, then his lower ribs. Much deeper, and he'd be swimming a death sentence in water this cold. His teeth chattered despite his efforts to stop them. 10 feet away, the bird cocked its head the other direction, studying him, judging whether he was threat or salvation. Jedidiah kept his movements slow, non-threatening. He'd gentled enough spooked horses to know that calm confidence was what frightened creatures needed to see. "Easy now," he said quietly. His voice sounded strange out here, absorbed by water and distance. "I'm not going to hurt you, just want to get you somewhere warm." The bird ruffled its feathers and screamed again, but this time the words came out garbled, less distinct. Up close, Jedidiah could see the creature was exhausted. Its eyes had that hollow look animals got when they'd been pushed past their limits. How long had it been out here? How long had it been repeating those words to an empty lake? 5 feet away now, the water lapped at his chest, each small wave sending fresh jolts of cold through him. His hands were completely numb. He'd need to be quick, grab the bird, tuck it against his body for warmth, get back to shore before hypothermia set in properly. 3 feet. He reached out slowly, hands open and steady. The parrot watched, head tilting back and forth, that curved beak opening as if to scream again. Jedidiah held his breath. One more step, and his boot touched the mast, and he looked down. What he saw drove every thought of cold straight out of his mind. The water here was crystalline, clear as glass, and in the morning light he could see straight to the bottom. 15 feet down, maybe 20, it was hard to judge distance through water, lay the wreckage of a river barge. Not just pieces, but the entire vessel, resting upright on the lake bottom, as if someone had set it there deliberately. The hull was intact, the cabin structure still standing, railings still attached. Silt had accumulated around the base, and water plants had begun their slow work of reclamation, but the barge looked remarkably preserved. It must have been carried here during the flood, just as he'd theorized, caught in the massive surge of water, lifted and transported miles from any navigable river, then deposited here when the floodwaters settled into this granite bowl. A ship out of water, becoming a ship underwater, waiting 3 decades for someone to find it. But that wasn't what stopped Jedidiah's breath. Sitting on the barge deck, visible through the clear water, was an iron safe. Not a small one, a genuine strongbox of the type banks used for large currency transports. It was easily 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, made of riveted iron plates with massive hinges on one side and what looked like a combination lock on the front. Rust had claimed much of the surface, turning the iron reddish-brown, but the structure looked intact, unbreached, sealed. Around the safe he could make out other details. Wooden crates collapsed into themselves, barrels still lashed to the deck. What might have been furniture inside the cabin, just shadows and shapes through the small windows. And near the bow, barely visible in the silt, something that might have been a nameplate or sign. "Take the gold," the parrot said quietly, almost conversationally. The desperation had gone from its voice, replaced by something that sounded almost like relief, as if, having found someone to deliver the message to, its urgent duty was finally complete. Jedidiah reached out and carefully lifted the bird from its perch. It came willingly, stepping onto his arm with surprising gentleness. Its talons were cold against his numb skin. The bird was lighter than he'd expected, all feathers and hollow bones, and it immediately pressed itself against his chest, seeking warmth. He turned and began wading back to shore, moving as quickly as he dared on the slippery rocks. The bird stayed tucked against him, silent now, except for occasional soft clicks from its beak. Behind them, the mast remained standing, marking the grave of whatever story had ended here 30 years ago. The cold really hit him when he climbed out onto the rocks. His legs shook so badly he almost fell. His fingers wouldn't close properly. His lips had gone blue. He could feel it even if he couldn't see it. But he had the bird, and the bird was alive. And beneath them, in the clear water, lay something that could rewrite every treasure story ever told in these mountains. He made it back to his camp through sheer stubbornness. Bess whickered nervously at the sight of the parrot, but she'd seen stranger things in her years with Jedidiah. He built up the fire until it roared, stripped off his wet clothes, and wrapped himself in both his wool blanket and his canvas tarp. The parrot he settled on a log near the fire, close enough for warmth but not so close it would be uncomfortable. For long minutes, Jedidiah just sat there shaking while his body remembered how to generate heat. His mind, though, was already racing ahead. A river barge, an iron safe, a parrot that screamed about gold, and the great flood of 75 that had rearranged half the geography of this mountain range. The pieces were there. They just needed assembly. River barges in 1875 had carried everything: freight, passengers, mail, occasionally valuables. Banks had used them to transport currency between Western settlements. The army had used them to move payroll, and after the war, when the South was being reconstructed and the West was being settled, there'd been a lot of money moving through a lot of rivers. There'd also been a lot of money that disappeared. Confederate gold was the most famous, but there were other fortunes that vanished in those chaotic years. Union payroll gone missing, bank shipments lost to river, accidents or robbery. Fortunes carried west by people fleeing east, or east by people fleeing west. The decade after the war had been a scrambled mess of broken systems and desperate people, and anything could have happened, including, apparently, a river barge full of gold ending up on the bottom of a lake that hadn't existed until the flood created it. The parrot made a soft, burbling sound. Jedidiah looked over to find the bird watching him with what seemed like intelligent interest. Its feathers were starting to dry, the colors deepening as they fluffed out. It looked healthier already, just from warmth and rest. "What's your story?" Jedidiah asked quietly. "How'd you end up here? Who taught you those words?" The bird tilted its head but didn't answer. Not with human words anyway, but its presence was answer enough. Parrots lived for decades. He'd heard some could reach 50 years or more. This bird could have been on that barge when it sank, could have been there when someone, the captain, probably had faced whatever final crisis made them cry out about gold and shooting, could have learned those words in the last moments before the boat went down, then somehow survived the flood and the mountain winter and 30 years of waiting. It seemed impossible, but then everything about this morning seemed impossible. Jedidiah pulled the blanket tighter and stared into the fire. His mind was working now, sorting through implications. That safe down there was real. Whatever was inside it was real. And if what was inside matched what the bird had been screaming about, then he was sitting on the biggest find these mountains had seen since the first gold strike at Cherry Creek. The question was, what did he do about it? By midday, Jedidiah had warmed enough to think clearly. The parrot had fallen asleep on its log perch, head tucked under one wing, apparently content for the first time in what must have been a very long time. The cattle grazed peacefully. Bess dozed with one hip cocked. The lake lay calm and blue under high sun, giving no hint of the treasure resting in its depths. Jedidiah pulled on dry clothes and made himself eat jerky and hardtack, washed down with creek water. His body needed fuel after the cold water ordeal, even if his mind was too occupied to notice hunger. He'd spent the morning mentally cataloguing everything he knew about salvage law, treasure claims, and property rights. It wasn't much. Ranch hands didn't typically need to understand admiralty law, but he knew enough to understand the basics. Whatever was down there, assuming he could get it up, wasn't automatically his just because he'd found it. There'd be claims to sort through. Original owners, if any could be found. The state, probably. Maybe the federal government, depending on what the cargo had been. And once word got out, and word always got out, there'd be fortune hunters, claim jumpers, and lawyers descending on this lake like locusts. The smart thing would be to ride down to Leadville, file a claim with the county recorder, and do this all legal and proper. Get the authorities involved, document everything, protect his discovery rights. That's what a sensible man would do. Jedidiah pulled out his pocket watch, a simple steel piece he'd carried for 20 years, and checked the time. 2 o'clock. If he left now, pushed hard, he could make it to Leadville by tomorrow evening. File his claim the next morning. Be back up here within 4 days. Maybe 5. 4 days for word to spread. 4 days for other people to start wondering what Quiet Smith had been doing, filing salvage claims on an alpine lake. 4 days for someone to decide to come up here and have a look for themselves. He snapped the watch shut and put it away. No. The smart thing and the right thing weren't always the same. Before he involved authorities and lawyers and whoever else would come crawling out of the woodwork, he needed to know what he was dealing with. Needed to see that safe up close. Needed to understand what the stakes really were. The parrot woke with a soft squawk and fixed him with that knowing eye. "Take the gold," it said, but conversationally now, without the screaming urgency. "I hear you," Jedidiah replied. "But gold's heavy, and that water's deep. Can't just wade out and carry it back." The problem was real enough. The safe sat 20 feet down, maybe more. He was a strong swimmer. Every ranch hand learned young, dealing with river crossings, but diving was different. The pressure, the cold, the limited time before you had to surface. And even if he could get down there, the safe had to weigh several hundred pounds. No man could lift that alone, even on dry land. He'd need equipment, rope, at minimum, something to pry with, in case the safe had been buried in silt or tangled in debris. And he'd need to be smarter about the cold, maybe rig some kind of heated rocks to warm himself between dives, extend his working time. More than that, he'd need time. Time to scout the wreck properly, to understand its layout, to figure out the safest approach. Time to practice diving in shallower water, to know his own limits. Time to solve the problem without killing himself in the process. Which meant staying up here. Days, probably. Maybe a week. That meant dealing with Tom Patterson, who expected Jedidiah back with those cattle by tomorrow at the latest. Patterson was a reasonable man, but he ran a business. He couldn't have ranch hands disappearing into the mountains for weeks at a time chasing treasure stories. Jedidiah stood and walked to the edge of the lake. In the clear afternoon light, he could make out the mast clearly, a dark vertical line against the blue-green water. Beyond it, if he squinted, he could just barely see the shadow of the barge hull. It looked peaceful down there, settled, like it had accepted its fate and made peace with the waiting. "Don't shoot," the parrot said behind him, and Jedidiah turned. The bird had hopped down from its log and was walking toward him with that peculiar side-to-side gait parrots had. Its head bobbed with each step, and its eyes stayed fixed on Jedidiah's face. "Who said that?" Jedidiah asked quietly. "Who were they talking to?" The bird cocked its head but offered no answer beyond another soft click of its beak. Of course it didn't. Whatever had happened on that barge, whatever final moments had taught this creature those desperate words, was lost to history now. The bird could repeat the sounds, but it couldn't explain them. Jedidiah knelt down so he was level with the parrot. Up close he could see more details. The bird was old. There was something in the way it moved, a slight stiffness that spoke of years. Its feet showed wear, the scales thickened and rough. But its eyes were bright and alert, and its feathers, despite everything, remained magnificent. "You've been waiting a long time," Jedidiah said, keeping watch, making sure nobody forgot. The parrot stepped closer and very gently touched its beak to Jedidiah's extended finger, not a bite, a gesture, contact, connection. Then it said, very clearly, "Take the gold." And Jedidiah understood, in that moment, that this wasn't just about treasure. This bird had been left with a mission, had spent 30 years trying to complete it. Whatever had happened on that barge, whoever had gone down with it, they'd trusted their parrot to carry the message forward, to tell someone, eventually, about the gold, about what lay beneath these cold waters. It was a trust that deserved honoring. Jedidiah made his decision. He'd stay, he'd work the problem, he'd get down to that safe and see what secrets it held, and he'd do it right, careful, methodical, alone. Once he knew what was really down there, then he could decide how to proceed, but first he had to see for himself. He spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. He had 50 feet of good hemp rope in his saddle pack. He'd need more, but it was a start. He fashioned a crude grappling hook from a broken horseshoe and some wire, something he could use to anchor the rope near the mast. He found a large, flat stone by the lake's edge that would serve as a weight to carry him down faster. He gathered more firewood than he'd need for a week, stacking it near his camp. As evening settled over the mountains and the temperature began to drop, Jedidiah wrote a letter to Tom Patterson. He explained that he'd found something up here that needed attention, that the cattle were safe, and that he'd need a few more days. He promised to explain everything when he returned. It wasn't much of an explanation, but it would have to do. He'd ride down tomorrow, just far enough to find a passing traveler or freight wagon he could trust with the letter. Then he'd come back and begin the real work. The parrot settled into sleep near the fire, warm and fed, and finally at rest. Jedidiah sat up long into the night, staring at the dark water and thinking about safes and gold and 30-year-old promises kept by a faithful bird. Somewhere down in that darkness lay answers. He just had to be patient enough and careful enough to find them. The next morning dawned cold and crystalline. Frost covered everything, the grass, the canvas tarp, even Bess's mane where she'd been standing still. Jedidiah woke before sunrise, built up the fire, and set about his preparations while the world was still grey with pre-dawn light. He'd slept poorly, his mind working through problems and scenarios. The cold water was the biggest challenge. Even if he could reach the safe, even if he could get it open, the cold would limit him to minutes at a time in the water. He'd black out if he stayed too long, and a man who blacked out underwater didn't wake up again. The parrot was already awake, preening its feathers near the fire. It had taken to Jedidiah's presence with surprising ease, following him around camp like a loyal dog. Every so often it would mutter, "Take the gold," or "Don't shoot," but the urgency had gone out of the words. Now they sounded more like habit, like an old man repeating familiar phrases because they brought comfort. Jedidiah drank his coffee and studied the lake in the growing light. The water was calmer than yesterday, barely a ripple disturbing the surface. Perfect conditions for what he had to do. He just wished he felt more confident about doing it. By full sunrise, he was ready. He'd stripped down to his union suit again, had the rope coiled and the grappling hook attached. The weight stone was tied to his belt with a short length of twine he could cut if needed. He'd heated several rocks in the fire, planning to use them to warm himself between dives. It was the best preparation he could manage with what he had. The first wade into the water was every bit as brutal as the day before. His body revolted against the cold, muscles clenching, breath coming in gasps. But he pushed through it, focused on moving steadily toward the mast. The rope played out behind him, tied off to a sturdy pine back on shore. When he reached the mast, he wrapped his legs around it for stability and prepared the grappling hook. His fingers were already clumsy with cold. He took several deep breaths, hyperventilating slightly to load his blood with oxygen, then filled his lungs completely and dove. The weight stone pulled him down quickly. The world went from bright sunlight to blue-green dimness in seconds. His ears popped as pressure built. The cold, intensified water this deep hadn't seen sunlight in decades, had never warmed beyond a few degrees above freezing. He kept his eyes open, despite the discomfort. The water was so clear he could see every detail of the wreck below him. The barge grew larger as he descended, its features becoming distinct. He could make out the cabin door, hanging half open. The iron safe on deck, just as massive as he'd thought. Coils of rope, still lashed to cleats. And there, something he hadn't seen from the surface, a nameplate near the bow, partially obscured by silt. His lungs started burning. 20 seconds, maybe. Not enough time. He kicked toward the nameplate, got close enough to brush away some of the silt with his hand, saw letters emerging RIS before his body screamed for air, and he had to kick for the surface. He broke into sunlight, gasping, clinging to the mast while his vision cleared. 30 seconds, underwater, if that. Barely enough time to see anything, let alone accomplish anything useful. This was going to be harder than he'd thought. 3 more dives that morning taught him the limits of what was possible. Each time, he managed to stay down a little longer, learned to move more efficiently, discovered new details about the wreck. The barge was called the Sunrise. He managed to read the full nameplate on his second dive. The cabin contained what looked like a captain's desk and chair, both bolted to the floor. The safe's combination dial was still intact, though covered in rust. And in the silt near the stern, he spotted something metallic that caught the filtered sunlight. On his 4th dive, he reached that metallic object. His lungs were screaming, his body was shutting down from the cold, but he pushed himself those extra few feet and closed his hand around it. Then he kicked hard for the surface, breaking into air with black spots dancing at the edges of his vision. Back on shore, wrapped in blankets and shaking by the fire, he examined his find. It was a coin, a large gold coin, unmistakable even through the tarnish and sediment. He scraped carefully at the surface with his knife until details emerged. A Confederate States of America $20 piece, dated 1861, rare as hen's teeth and worth considerably more than its weight in gold to the right collector. One coin didn't prove anything by itself. It could have been a personal possession, could have been dropped accidentally. But combined with everything else, the safe, the parrot's warning, the barge's presence in an impossible location, it painted a picture. The Sunrise had been carrying Confederate gold, a lot of it, if the size of that safe was any indication. And it had been swept up here during the flood, taking its cargo and its secrets to the bottom of a lake that hadn't existed the day before. Jedidiah turned the coin over in his fingers, feeling the weight of it. This single piece was probably worth more than he made in 6 months of ranch work. If the safe was full of them, and take the gold suggested it was, then he was looking at a fortune that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone in the valley below. That kind of money brought attention. It brought complications. It brought danger. The parrot waddled over and studied the coin with interest. "Take the gold," it said approvingly. "I'm working on it," Jedidiah replied. His teeth were still chattering despite the fire and blankets. "But that safe weighs more than a horse. Can't just pick it up and carry it out." The problem occupied his mind for the rest of the day. The safe was too heavy to lift, too deep to easily access, and almost certainly locked. Even if he could get it to the surface, which would require equipment he didn't have opening, it would require either the combination or a lot of explosive, neither of which he possessed. But the safe didn't have to come up, not the whole thing anyway. If he could get it open down there, he could bring up the contents a bit at a time. Gold was heavy, but individual coins or bars would be manageable. He could make multiple trips, cache the gold somewhere safe, and retrieve it gradually. Of course, opening a safe underwater presented its own challenges. The lock mechanism would be frozen with rust and sediment. He'd need tools, a pry bar maybe, or a cold chisel. He'd need to work carefully to avoid damaging whatever was inside. And he'd need to do all of it while holding his breath in water cold enough to kill him. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Jedidiah made a decision. Tomorrow he'd ride down far enough to find that passing traveler, get his letter to Patterson delivered. Then he'd continue to the nearest mining supply post. There was one in a settlement called Fairplay, about a day's ride from here. He'd buy proper equipment, diving weights, better rope, tools for working underwater, maybe even talk to some of the old-timers who'd worked submerged mining operations, get their advice. It would cost him most of his savings. It would take several more days. But it would give him a real chance at success, instead of just dying in cold water trying to be heroic. The parrot settled onto his shoulder, a warm weight against his neck. Together they watched the lake turn gold, then orange, then purple as the sun set. Somewhere down in that darkness, the sunrise waited. It had waited 30 years already. It could wait a few more days. Jedidiah returned to Crystal Lake 3 days later with a pack mule loaded with equipment and considerably lighter pockets. The trip to Fairplay had been productive but expensive. He'd acquired a proper diving weight belt, 75 feet of new manila rope, a set of cold chisels, 2 heavy pry bars, and a waterproof canvas bag for bringing up whatever he found. The old-timer who ran the mining supply had asked questions, polite ones, but questions nonetheless. Jedidiah had told him he was clearing debris from a spring that fed Patterson's ranch. A lie, but a necessary one. What concerned him more was the conversation he'd overheard in Fairplay's only saloon. 2 men, both rough-looking types who made their living on the edges of the law, talking about Confederate gold. According to their telling, a treasury shipment had gone missing in the spring of '75, right around the time of the Great Flood. $20,000 in gold coin and bullion, last seen on a river barge called the Sunrise. The men had laughed about it, another lost treasure story, the kind that surfaced every few years and led nowhere. But Jedidiah hadn't been laughing. The name Sunrise had sent cold fingers down his spine. These men were already looking, already following rumors. If they caught wind of what he'd found, they'd come running. Men like that didn't file claims or respect salvage rights. They took what they wanted and dealt with consequences later. He'd left Fairplay that same evening, pushing hard to get back to the lake before dawn. The parrot had been waiting for him, apparently content to stay near the camp, even though Jedidiah had left enough food and water for only a day. The bird greeted his return with a cheerful, "Take the gold." That would have been funny under other circumstances. Now, with proper equipment, Jedidiah began the real work. He spent the first day establishing a better dive setup. He anchored a float directly over the wreck, a large log he'd found downstream, and maneuvered into position. From this, he ran a weighted line straight down to the barge deck, giving him something to follow that would save precious seconds on each dive. He practiced with the weight belt, learning how it changed his buoyancy, how to control his descent and ascent. The second day, he brought up more artifacts from the wreck, a ship's compass in a brass housing, still intact, a leather satchel that fell apart in his hands, but yielded several waterlogged papers he carefully laid out to dry, a captain's log, miraculously preserved in a waxed canvas cover, though the pages were stuck together and would require patient, careful separation. It was the log that made his hands shake as he sat by the fire that evening. This was history. This was proof. Whatever story had ended on that barge 30 years ago, the truth of it was written in those pages. Once he could read them, he'd know what had happened, who had been aboard, and most importantly, what legal claim he might actually have to whatever was in that safe. The parrot seemed to sense his excitement. It hopped along the log where he'd set the salvaged items, inspecting each one with cocked head and bright eyes. When it reached the captain's log, it made a soft, mournful sound. Not words, just a low, sad call that raised goosebumps on Jedidiah's arms. "You remember this," Jedidiah said quietly, "don't you? You remember the captain, the boat, all of it." The bird looked at him with what seemed like profound sadness. Then it said, very softly, "Don't shoot." Something in the way it said those words resigned, Grief heavy told Jedidiah more than any written account might. The captain had died badly, had faced violence in those final moments. The gold had been worth killing for then, and it would be worth killing for now. That realization settled over Jedidiah like a cold blanket. He'd been thinking of this as a salvage operation, a puzzle to solve. But men had died for this gold, and if word got out, more men might die yet. He carefully wrapped the captain's log in dry canvas and stored it in his saddlebag. Tomorrow he'd try to separate some of the pages, see what he could read. But tonight he needed to think about security, about what happened when, not if, but when other people learned what he'd found. The lake sat in a natural bowl with only 3 practical approaches. The trail he'd used coming up from Patterson's ranch was the easiest, following a creek drainage that was gentle enough for horses and cattle. There was a harder route from the north, over a ridge that required scrambling over rock fields, and a third approach from the east, through a narrow canyon that was treacherous but passable for a determined person on foot. Any of those routes could bring trouble, and up here, with no neighbors for miles, trouble could arrive without warning. He had his rifle, his revolver, and enough ammunition for a sustained fight if it came to that. But he was one man. If a group decided to take this place by force, he'd have a hard time holding them off. The smart thing again, the smart thing he kept not doing, would be to ride down now, bring up help, file that claim, and make this all legal and public. But legal and public meant the government getting involved, meant lawyers and politicians and bureaucrats who'd tie this up in courts for years while they argued over who owned what. Meant that fortune down there would benefit everyone except the man who'd actually found it. Jedidiah poked at the fire, watching sparks rise into the dark sky. He'd never been a greedy man, hadn't spent his life chasing wealth or status. But this felt different. This felt earned. He'd found the wreck, he'd identified the ship, he'd been the one brave enough or foolish enough to dive into that killing cold water. If there was a reward to be had, shouldn't it come to him? More than that, though, was the parrot, the bird that had kept faith for 30 years, that had guarded this secret through mountain winters and summers, that had never stopped calling out its warning to empty air. That loyalty deserved respect, deserved completion, and Jedidiah couldn't shake the feeling that bringing up that gold, finishing what the captain had started, would somehow honor both the man and the bird who'd loved him. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Jedidiah looked up to see clouds building over the western peaks, dark and heavy with rain. A storm was coming, not unusual for late afternoon in the high mountains, but inconvenient timing. Rain would make diving impossible, would churn up the lake bottom and ruin visibility for days. He secured his camp quickly, moving everything under the canvas tarp, making sure the parrot had shelter near the still glowing coals of the fire. The bird seemed unconcerned by the approaching weather, content to tuck itself into a dry corner and doze. The storm hit an hour after sunset. Not a gentle rain, but a deluge, the kind that turned creeks into rivers and trails into mudslides. Lightning split the sky, thunder cracked so loud it hurt, and wind tore at the tarp until Jedidiah had to add extra guy lines to keep it from ripping away entirely. He sat under minimal shelter, watching water pour off the tarp's edges, and thought about the flood of 75. It must have been something like this, only worse, only sustained. 3 weeks of rain, they'd said. 3 weeks of water coming down in sheets, filling every valley, overwhelming every drainage. No wonder the sunrise had been carried so far from any navigable river. The whole mountain range had turned into one massive, raging river that day. Somewhere out there in the darkness and the rain, the lake was rising. Water was pouring into it from a dozen creeks and springs, adding to its volume, changing its level. By morning, that mast might be deeper than it had been. The landmarks he'd used might be submerged. Everything he'd learned about the wreck's location might need to be relearned. But the gold would still be there, the safe would still wait on the bottom, the sunrise would still rest in its mountain grave. Weather could delay him, but it couldn't change the fundamental truth of what he'd found. The parrot stirred in its corner, ruffling wet feathers. "Take the gold," it murmured, half asleep. Then, softer, "Don't shoot." Jedidiah pulled his blanket tighter and settled in to wait out the storm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did, but tonight he was still here, still alive, still determined to see this through. That would have to be enough. The storm cleared by morning, leaving the world washed clean and sharp. The lake had risen nearly 3 feet, just as Jedidiah had feared. His float marker bobbed in a different position, the mast below now completely submerged. Everything would need to be re-established, re-measured, relearned. He was preparing for his first post-storm dive when he heard horses. The sound came from the southern trail, the main route up from Patterson's ranch. Multiple horses moving at a steady pace, not trying to be quiet. Jedidiah's hand went to his rifle automatically, but he didn't pick it up. Not yet. Could be legitimate travelers, could be Patterson himself, come to check on his missing ranch hand. No reason to assume threat. But he moved the parrot into deeper cover anyway, back behind some rocks where it wouldn't be immediately visible. The bird went willingly, sensing his tension. "Don't shoot," it said quietly, and Jedidiah found the timing grimly appropriate. 3 riders emerged from the trees 10 minutes later. Jedidiah recognized none of them. The lead man was tall and lean, somewhere in his 40s, with a cavalry moustache and the kind of eyes that missed nothing. He wore good clothes, not fancy, but well-made and well-maintained. A businessman's clothes. The 2 men with him were clearly hired muscle, the kind who made their living with fists and guns. The lead man reined in 30 feet from Jedidiah's camp and touched his hat brim politely. "Morning," he said. His voice was educated, Eastern. "You'd be Jedidiah Smith, I'm guessing?" No point denying it. "I would. And you'd be someone who's made considerable effort to find me." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Leonard Hutchins. I represent certain financial interests in Denver. Mind if we step down? Been riding since before dawn, and my back's complaining." Jedidiah nodded. He kept his hands visible and away from weapons, reading the same courtesy from Hutchins. The 2 hired men stayed mounted, hands resting casually near their holsters. Everyone was being very polite, very careful. That meant the violence, if it came, would be sudden and final. Hutchins stretched his back and walked toward the lake, moving like a man admiring scenery. "Beautiful spot," he said. "Can see why you'd want to spend time up here. Though I understand you're supposed to be working for Tom Patterson. He's been somewhat concerned about your absence." "Sent him word I needed time," Jedidiah said. "Personal business." "Ah, yes, personal business." Hutchins turned to face him. The polite facade was still in place, but something harder showed underneath. Business involving a sunken river barge, perhaps? A barge called the Sunrise? Jedidiah's stomach went cold, but he kept his face neutral. "Don't know what you're talking about." "No?" Hutchins pulled a paper from his coat pocket. "Interesting, because 3 days ago you purchased a considerable amount of diving equipment in Fairplay. You told the shopkeeper you were clearing a spring, but springs don't require 75 feet of rope. And then there's the matter of you asking questions about water depth and pressure. Specific questions that suggest specific knowledge. Man can't ask questions now? Of course he can." Hutchins folded the paper and put it away. "But when a man asks those questions 3 days after being seen studying old flood maps in the Leadville courthouse, and 2 days after inquiring about river barges at the Historical Society, well, that man develops an interesting pattern. Someone had been following him, watching him, documenting his movements. Jedidiah felt anger rise but pushed it down. Anger made you stupid, and stupid got you killed. "Even if I had found something," Jedidiah said carefully, "it would be my find. My claim, law's pretty clear on salvage rights." "The law is indeed clear," Hutchins agreed. "Unfortunately, the law also requires proper filing and documentation, which you haven't done, which makes this," He gestured at the lake, an unregistered find, open to claim by anyone who discovers it. Like you, like my employers. Hutchins pulled out another paper. The Denver Mining Consortium holds legal interest in all Confederate assets recovered within territorial boundaries. We have documentation, legal standing, and most importantly, the resources to extract and secure such assets properly. What we're offering, Mr. Smith, is a finder's fee, 10% of whatever's recovered, paid in cash, no questions asked. You go back to working for Mr. Patterson. We handle the complicated business of salvage and legal proceedings. 10%. If the safe held $20,000 in gold, that would be $2,000 for Jedidiah, more money than he'd see in 5 years of ranch work, a life-changing sum for most men. But something in Hutchins' tone, in the way his men sat their horses with hands near guns, told Jedidiah what finder's fee really meant. They'd give him nothing, they'd take everything. And if he pushed back, if he insisted on legal rights or proper documentation, well, men disappeared in these mountains all the time. Accidents happened. Need to think about it, Jedidiah said. Of course. Take your time, Hutchins smiled, that empty smile again. We'll be establishing our own camp just down the trail, close enough to be neighborly. You let us know when you've decided. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Smith, if you were thinking of riding down to file a claim yourself, don't. We have men watching the trails. For your own safety, you understand. These mountains can be dangerous. The 3 men mounted and rode back the way they'd come. Jedidiah watched until they were out of sight, then immediately began breaking camp. They'd be back, probably tonight, and they wouldn't be polite next time. His only advantage was that they didn't know exactly where the wreck was. The lake was a quarter-mile across. Finding the sunrise would take them time. Time he could use. He worked fast, moving essential gear to a hidden spot up in the rocks where he'd cached the captain's log and the gold coin. The parrot he moved with him, carrying the bird on his shoulder while he worked. Everything else, the tent, the fire pit, the obvious signs of his presence, he left in place. Let them think he was still down here, waiting like a good boy to accept their generous offer. By midday, he'd established a new position in the rocks above the lake. From here, he could see the entire basin, could watch Hutchins' camp and his own empty one. More importantly, he had a clear sight line to the mast location. If they started diving, he'd know it. But they couldn't dive yet. They didn't know the exact spot, and the lake, muddied by last night's storm, wouldn't show them anything from the surface. They'd need to search, to probe, to waste days covering water he'd already mapped, unless they made him tell them. Unless they decided the 10% offer had been too generous and applied more direct methods of negotiation. Jedidiah checked his rifle, 30 rounds plus what was in the magazine. His revolver held 6 more, against 3 men, probably more if Hutchins called in additional help. Not great odds, but he'd faced worse. During the war, during the wild years after, he'd learned that a prepared man in good cover was worth 10 men in the open. The parrot nestled against his neck, warm and trusting. "Don't shoot," it said softly. "Can't promise that," Jedidiah replied, "but I'll try." He settled in to watch and wait. The gold had been down there for 30 years. It could wait a few more days while he figured out how to stay alive long enough to claim it. And if Hutchins thought an old ranch hand would just roll over and accept being robbed, well, Leonard Hutchins hadn't spent enough time around men who'd made their living in hard country. He was about to get educated. Jedidiah spent that afternoon carefully separating pages of the captain's log. The waxed canvas cover had done its job. Most of the interior pages were readable, though water-stained and fragile. He worked with patience, learned from years of handling injured animals, peeling each page apart with gentle pressure, laying them out on flat rocks to dry in the sun. The entries were dated from January through April of 1875. The captain's name was William Hutchins, and that stopped Jedidiah cold. Hutchins. The same name as the man who'd threatened him that morning. That couldn't be coincidence. He read more carefully, his unease growing with each entry. The 15th of January, 1875. Commission accepted from Department of Treasury. Will transport sealed cargo from Memphis to Denver. Military escort provided. Payment generous enough to set up William Jr. for life. Mary would have been proud. February 3. Departed Memphis. Cargo secure. Escort consists of 4 former Union soldiers, all vetted. They don't know contents, only that it's Treasury business. Better that way. February 28. River ice worse than expected. Lost 2 days to blockage near Kansas City. Escort getting nervous. One of them, Briggs, asking too many questions about the cargo weight. March 15. Trouble. Briggs tried to force the safe open last night. I caught him with a pry bar. Had to threaten him with my pistol. He backed down, but the look in his eyes, I've seen that look before. On men who've decided killing is worth the reward. March 20. 3 escorts deserted in the night. Only Walker remains. We're making for Denver but taking secondary routes. If Briggs talked in the last town, we'll have men after us. The Parrot, God help me. I talk to the Parrot now, seems to understand we're in danger. Smart bird. Smarter than me for taking this job. The entries became shorter, more desperate. Captain Hutchins described being followed, changing routes, moving mostly at night. The cargo he was transporting wasn't Confederate gold at all, it was Union gold. Treasury payment for Western expansion, for railroad bonds, for the complex financial machinery that was building a nation out of wilderness. $22,000 in double eagles, meant for the Denver Mint. April 3. Saw riders on the ridge this morning, 4 of them. Briggs found help. We're trapped. Can't go forward to Denver, can't go back east. The spring floods are starting, rivers rising everywhere. Walker says we should dump the safe, save ourselves. But I gave my word means something. April 7. The rain won't stop. Been raining for 4 days straight. River so high it's jumped its banks. We're looking for high ground, but everything's water now. The sunrise is sturdy, but she wasn't built for this. If we don't find shelter soon. The final entry was dated the 9th of April, 1875. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written in desperate circumstances. The flood has us. Water everywhere, moving too fast to fight. We're being carried north, away from any river we know. Briggs and his men caught up there in a boat behind us, firing rifles. Told Calhoun to guard the safe no matter what happens. He's a good bird, loyal. If we don't make it through this, if someone finds us someday, tell them William Hutchins died keeping his word. Tell them the gold was never ours to take, that his father loved him, and everything I did was to give him a better life than I had. Then, at the very bottom, in letters that were barely legible, "Don't shoot, take the gold." The captain's final words, shouted, probably, in those last moments as the flood swept him away and Briggs's men kept firing. The Parrot Calhoun had learned them and carried them forward through 30 years of patient waiting. Jedidiah sat back, his mind reeling. Leonard Hutchins wasn't some opportunistic treasure hunter. He was the captain's son, the William Jr., who'd been set up for life, except his father had never made it to Denver, and the money had gone down with the sunrise. Leonard had spent 30 years following rumors, chasing stories, trying to recover his father's last delivery. And, probably, trying to recover his father's body. The thought settled over Jedidiah like a weight. He'd been thinking of this as treasure, as salvage, as a puzzle to solve. But for Leonard Hutchins, this was personal. This was the father he'd lost. The promise that had never been fulfilled, the word that had been kept at the cost of everything. No wonder the man had resources and determination. No wonder he'd tracked Jedidiah so effectively. The Parrot Calhoun waddled over and looked at the log pages with that cocked head curiosity birds had. "Don't shoot," it said softly. Then, "Take the gold." "Your captain's son is down there," Jedidiah said. The bird just blinked at him. Whatever intelligence parrots possessed, It probably didn't extend to understanding family relationships across generations. But the bird had known Captain Hutchins, had loved him in whatever way birds loved, had stayed faithful to his last command even when decades passed, and any reasonable creature would have given up and flown away. Jedidiah looked down at Hutchins' camp, barely visible through the trees. The man was sitting by his fire, alone. His hired guns were somewhere else, probably watching the trails, as he'd said. Leonard Hutchins was having coffee and waiting, just like Jedidiah had been, for this situation to resolve itself. The smart thing, and maybe finally actually the right thing, would be to go down there and talk, to show Leonard the log, to explain what his father had faced, to work this out between two men who'd both lost things and were trying to find them again. The gold was legally Leonard's anyway, probably. His father had been transporting it under treasury contract. The treasury would have compensated the loss, would have paid out the bond, would have transferred ownership. 3 decades of legal proceedings had likely already settled who owned what. But that wasn't what stopped Jedidiah's breath. What stopped his breath was the realization that if Leonard Hutchins knew what his father had written, knew that there was proof of his father's honor and sacrifice, knew that William Hutchins had died keeping his word, it might change everything. It might turn this from a hostile salvage situation into something that could be handled with dignity. Or it might make Leonard more desperate, more willing to do anything, hurt anyone, to reach the wreck and recover not just gold, but his father's legacy. Jedidiah carefully gathered the log pages and wrapped them back in canvas. This was information, and information was power. He needed to think carefully about how and when to use it. The wrong move now could get him killed. The right move might get everyone what they actually needed. The sun was setting, painting the lake in shades of orange and red. Jedidiah watched the water and thought about fathers and sons, about promises kept and debts unpaid, about how the past never really lets go of us. It just waits, patient and persistent, until we're ready to settle accounts. Calhoun, the parrot, settled on his shoulder, a warm weight in the cooling evening air. The bird had waited 30 years to deliver its message, had called out across empty mountains, had survived impossible winters, had kept faith when any sane creature would have given up, all for a man who'd loved it, who'd given it a name and a purpose and a reason to keep going. That kind of loyalty deserved respect. Whatever happened next, whatever decisions Jedidiah made, he owed it to Captain William Hutchins and his faithful bird to do this right. Not fast, not easy, but right. He spent the night reading through the rest of the log, learning about the captain's life, his hopes, his fears, learning about a man who'd valued his word above his safety, who'd died trying to complete a job he'd been hired to do. A man not so different from Jedidiah himself, just a working man trying to make his way in a hard world, trying to leave something behind that mattered. By morning, Jedidiah had made his decision. It might be the wrong one. It might get him killed. But it was the decision that felt true to the man he'd tried to be for 56 years. He was going down to talk to Leonard Hutchins, and he was bringing the captain's log with him. Jedidiah descended to Hutchins' camp at first light, walking openly with the captain's log wrapped in canvas under one arm and Calhoun riding on his shoulder. His rifle he left behind in the rocks. A man coming to talk didn't bring a rifle. A man coming to talk brought evidence and honest words. Hutchins was awake, sitting by his fire with coffee. He stood quickly when he saw Jedidiah approach, his hand moving toward his holster before he registered the lack of weapons. The 2 hired men materialized from the trees on either side, rifles ready but not yet aimed. "Mr. Smith," Hutchins said carefully, "this is unexpected." "Figured we should talk," Jedidiah replied. He stopped 10 feet from the fire, far enough to be respectful, close enough to be heard clearly. "I've got something you need to see. If this is about negotiating that finder's fee upward, it's about your father." Hutchins went very still. His face, which had been carefully neutral, showed a flash of something raw and painful. "What do you know about my father?" Jedidiah unwrapped the canvas and held out the log. Captain William Hutchins commanded the river barge Sunrise, died in the flood of '75 trying to deliver Treasury gold to Denver. I found his log yesterday, thought you should read it. Hutchins took the log with hands that shook slightly. He opened it, saw his father's handwriting, and for a moment looked like he might break down completely. Then he controlled himself, that business-like mask settling back into place. But his voice was rough when he spoke. "Where did you find this?" "In the wreck. 15 feet down, wrapped in waxed canvas. It survived because your father was careful, even at the end." Jedidiah gestured to the fire. "Read it. I can wait." Hutchins sat down heavily and began reading. Jedidiah stood there, aware of the 2 hired guns watching him, aware of how vulnerable he was. But some things required risk, some things required faith. Calhoun shifted on Jedidiah's shoulder and said, very quietly, "Don't shoot." One of the hired guns, a hard-faced man with a scar across his nose, looked at the parrot with surprise. "That bird talks?" "That bird," Jedidiah said, "belonged to Captain Hutchins. Been waiting on that wreck for 30 years. Calling out the captain's last words, figured his son might want to meet him." Hutchins looked up from the log, his eyes wet. "Calhoun. My father wrote about a parrot named Calhoun. I thought it was dead. Thought everything was dead." "Parrots live a long time," Jedidiah said, "and some of them are loyal beyond reason. Your father loved this bird, and this bird loved your father. It's been keeping watch all these years, waiting for someone to find them." Hutchins returned to reading. Jedidiah watched emotions play across the man's face: grief, pride, anger, sadness. When he reached the final entry, tears actually fell. He didn't bother wiping them away. "He died keeping his word," Hutchins said, his voice breaking. "They were shooting at him, the flood was taking him, and he still wouldn't give up the gold." "The kind of man," Jedidiah said gently, "who raises the kind of son who'd spent 30 years trying to finish his father's delivery. You've been looking for this wreck a long time, haven't you? Trying to complete what he started." Hutchins nodded. "Since I was 16. Since the Treasury told my mother they couldn't recover the shipment, couldn't even find the barge. She died believing my father had run off with the gold, that he'd abandoned us. I knew better. I knew he'd never break his word, but I couldn't prove it." He held up the log. "The gold's still down there," Jedidiah said. "In the safe, on the barge deck. I've seen it. I've touched it. Getting it up, that's going to take work, but it's possible. And you want your share." Hutchins' voice had gone flat again, defensive. "I want what's fair," Jedidiah said. "Legal salvage rate is probably 10%, which is what you offered. I'll take that, if it's offered honest and paid honest. But more than that, I want this done right. Your father died trying to deliver that gold where it belonged. Seems to me we owe it to him to finish the job properly. The Treasury wrote it off 30 years ago. The insurance paid out. Legally, the gold belongs to whoever recovers it. Then legally," Jedidiah said, "it belongs to both of us. I found it. You're the captain's heir. We work together, or we both go home empty-handed, because I can't lift that safe alone, and you can't find the exact location without me." Hutchins studied him for a long moment. Then he stood and offered his hand. "Partners, then. Equal shares. We bring up the gold, turn it over to the Treasury, they'll probably let us keep the salvage value, and we split whatever comes of it fair down the middle." Jedidiah shook his hand. "Equal shares, and your father's name gets cleared. That's part of the deal. The log goes to the Historical Society, the story gets told right. William Hutchins kept his word, even when it killed him." "Deal." Hutchins looked at the parrot. "And Calhoun?" "Calhoun's been doing this job alone long enough," Jedidiah said. "He's earned his retirement. I'll keep him, if he's willing. Give him a warm place to live out whatever years he's got left." Calhoun ruffled his feathers and made a contented sound. Message delivered, duty complete. He seemed ready to let someone else worry about the gold. They spent that day planning the operation. Hutchins had resources, Jedidiah lacked block and tackle, a proper diving helmet with air pump, waterproof charges for breaking the safe open if the lock wouldn't turn. He'd brought them all, had been preparing for this moment for years. What he hadn't had was the location. The lake was too big, the water too murky after the storm. He could have searched for weeks and missed the wreck by yards. But together, with Jedidiah's knowledge of the exact location and Hutchins' equipment, they had a real chance. The two hired guns turned out to be brothers named Frank and Samuel Morris. Once the situation changed from hostile takeover to legitimate salvage, they relaxed considerably. Frank was a former Navy diver who'd worked on shipwrecks off the California coast. Samuel was a demolition man who'd spent 10 years in Colorado's deep mines. Both knew their business, and both seemed relieved to be working an honest job instead of whatever strong-arm tactics Hutchins had originally planned. Truth be told, Frank admitted, as they rigged the diving equipment, I didn't much like the idea of robbing an old cowboy at gunpoint, but Mr. Hutchins was paying well, and a man's got to eat. Understand that, Jedidiah said. Hard times make hard choices. By evening, they had a complete plan. Tomorrow they'd lower Frank down in the diving helmet to assess the safe and the wreck. He'd determine whether the combination lock could be forced, whether they'd need to use charges, and how stable the barge was after 30 years underwater. Once they knew what they were dealing with, they'd develop a recovery strategy. The work might take days, might take weeks, but with 4 men working together, proper equipment, and a clear goal, it was achievable. That night, Jedidiah sat with Leonard Hutchins by the fire, while Frank and Samuel took first watch up on the ridge. You couldn't be too careful, word had a way of spreading, and other treasure hunters might come calling. Better to be prepared. Hutchins was reading through his father's log again, more slowly this time, savoring it. He wrote about me, he said quietly. Talked about setting me up for life, about wanting me to have better than he did. I was 12 when he took this job. I barely remember him. Just impressions, big hands, loud laugh, always smelled like pipe tobacco. He loved you, Jedidiah said. That comes through clear in every entry. I've spent 30 years angry at him for dying, for leaving us, for taking a job that got him killed. Hutchins looked up. Reading this, knowing he died, trying to keep his word, I don't know if that makes it better or worse. Makes it real, Jedidiah said. Makes it something you can understand. Sometimes that's all we get. Calhoun was roosting in a small cage they'd fashioned from spare wire, not to trap him, but to keep him safe from predators at night. He watched them through the bars with bright, knowing eyes. Every so often he'd murmur, "Don't shoot," or "Take the gold," but the words had lost their urgency. They'd become comfort sounds, familiar phrases that helped him settle. "Thank you," Hutchins said suddenly, "for bringing me the log, for not just taking the gold and running. You could have, you know. I'd have never found it without you. Your father died doing the right thing," Jedidiah said. "Seemed wrong to dishonor that by doing the wrong thing myself. Besides," he smiled slightly, "I'm too old to spend my remaining years looking over my shoulder, wondering when the law or your hired guns would catch up. Frank and Sam aren't killers, just men who work for money. If I'd told them to let you go, but you didn't know if you'd tell them that," Jedidiah said. "Not until you read that log, not until you knew what kind of man your father really was." Hutchins was quiet for a moment. Then, "No, I didn't know. I was desperate enough to do almost anything. Finding him, it's changed things." They sat in companionable silence, 2 men who'd nearly been enemies, now bound together by circumstance and shared purpose. Above them, stars wheeled in clear mountain sky. Below them, cold water held secrets 3 decades old, and tomorrow they'd begin the work of bringing those secrets into light. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was. But sometimes Jedidiah thought the hard work was exactly what gave meaning to the reward. Dawn broke cold and clear, the kind of mountain morning that made men grateful for coffee and fire. Frank was already suited up in the diving equipment. By the time the sun cleared the eastern peaks, a heavy canvas suit, weighted boots, and the brass diving helmet that would let him stay underwater for extended periods. The air pump sat on the shore, Samuel ready to work the handle that would push oxygen down through the long rubber hose. Jedidiah and Hutchins had spent the early hours rigging a more substantial platform over the wreck site. They'd lashed together several logs to create a stable base, anchored it with heavy stones, and run guide ropes down to the barge deck. From this platform, they could lower equipment, receive salvaged items, and maintain communication with Frank below. "You remember the signals?" Hutchins asked Frank for the third time. He was nervous and trying not to show it. This was the moment 30 years of searching had been leading toward. 1 tug, I'm fine. 2 tugs, send down tools. 3 tugs, pull me up immediately. Frank's voice was muffled inside the helmet. "I've done this before, Mr. Hutchins. I'll be careful." They lowered him slowly, Samuel controlling the rope while Jedidiah worked the air pump. The hose played out as Frank descended, bubbles rising to mark his progress. At 15 feet, he reached the barge deck. 1 tug on the rope, I'm fine. The weight was excruciating. Hutchins paced the platform, watching the bubbles move across the deck below. Jedidiah kept his rhythm steady on the pump, counting each stroke, making sure Frank had constant air. Samuel stood ready, with tools, pry bars, a heavy hammer, cold chisels wrapped in oilcloth. 2 tugs, send down tools. They lowered a canvas bag containing the pry bars and hammer. Frank's shadow was visible below, moving around the safe. More bubbles rose as he worked. Minutes stretched into a quarter hour, then half an hour. Jedidiah's arms burned from pumping, but he didn't slow down. A man's life depended on that steady rhythm. 1 tug. I'm fine. More waiting, more bubbles. The sun climbed higher, warming the air but doing nothing for the ice-cold water below. Jedidiah found himself thinking about Captain Hutchins, about those final moments when the flood had taken the sunrise. Had he known he was dying? Had he hoped someone would find them eventually? Had he told Calhoun those final words, knowing the bird might carry them forward? 3 tugs. Pull me up. They hauled on the rope together, all 3 of them, bringing Frank up as quickly as was safe. When he broke the surface, Hutchins scrambled to help him onto the platform. They got the helmet off, and Frank sucked in great lungfuls of mountain air, his face red from effort and cold. "It's there," he gasped. "The safe is intact. Locks rusted solid. I could barely see the dial. But the hinges," he grinned, "the hinges might be our way in. They're exposed, corroded. I think we can chisel through them, take the door off from the back instead of trying to force the lock." "How long?" Hutchins asked. "In this cold? I can work maybe 15 minutes at a time before I lose feeling in my hands. We're looking at multiple dives, 3, maybe 4, but it's doable." Frank accepted the blanket Jedidiah offered, wrapped it around his shoulders. "There's something else. Your father's in there." Hutchins went pale. "In the safe?" "In the cabin. I saw him through the window, still at his desk, like he was just resting. The cold water preserved him. I didn't go in. Wasn't sure if you'd want me to, but he's there, sir. Your father's still with his ship." "A knot." "1 knot." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Hutchins stared down at the water, his hands clenched on the platform edge. Jedidiah saw the muscles in his jaw working, saw him fighting for control. "He deserves to be brought up," Hutchins said finally. "Not left down there in the dark. After we get the safe, we bring him up. We bury him proper, with his name and his story told true." "Yes, sir," Frank said quietly. "We'll do that." They rested for an hour, let Frank warm up and regain strength. Then he went down again, this time with the chisels and hammer. The sound came up through the water, muffled but steady, metal on metal, the patient work of breaking rust-fused iron. 15 minutes of work, 30 minutes of rest and warming, then down again. By noon, Frank had chiseled through the first hinge. By mid-afternoon, the second. One more dive, he said, one more session of work, and they'd have the safe door off. But as he prepared for that final dive, Samuel pointed to the southern trail. "Riders," he said quietly. "3 of them, coming fast." Jedidiah grabbed his rifle and climbed to a better vantage point. 3 men on horseback, pushing hard up the trail. He didn't recognize them from this distance, but he recognized trouble when he saw it. Someone had learned about the wreck. Someone was coming to take what they'd found, and they were running out of time. The 3 riders pulled up 50 yards from the lake, close enough to see what was happening, but far enough to avoid easy rifle range. Jedidiah recognized the leader immediately. Briggs' grandson. Had to be. He had the same narrow face, the same cold eyes from the daguerreotype Hutchins had shown him from his father's log. Some family resemblances ran bone deep. "That's public water," the man called out. His voice carried clear across the distance. "Whatever you're pulling up belongs to whoever can claim it first. We're filing our own salvage claim." Hutchins stepped forward, holding the captain's log above his head. "This is E.U.S. Treasury property, lost during official transport in 1875. We have documentation, legal authority, and the rightful claim as the captain's heir. You want to contest that, you do it in court." "Courts take time," the man replied, "and accidents happen in the mountains. Men fall, equipment breaks. Would be a shame if something unfortunate occurred before you could file that claim." Samuel and Frank had moved to flanking positions, rifles ready but not aimed. Jedidiah kept his. Winchester pointed at the ground for now. The mathematics of violence were clear enough. 3 against 4, but they had the high ground and the equipment. Any fight would be costly for both sides. "Your grandfather tried to steal this gold," Hutchins said. His voice was steady, cold. "He chased my father through a flood, shot at him while he was drowning. My father died keeping his word. You want to honor that legacy of theft and murder, that's your choice. But you'll have to kill 4 men to do it, and I promise you some of us will still be standing when you fall." The standoff stretched for long seconds. Jedidiah could see the calculation happening behind the leader's eyes, could see him weighing profit against risk, gold against life. Men like this, men who lived by taking what they wanted, they understood force, they understood cost. You just had to make the cost clear enough. "Frank," Jedidiah said quietly, not taking his eyes off the riders, "how long to get that safe door off?" 10 minutes, maybe less. "Then get down there and finish it. We'll handle this." Frank didn't argue. He pulled the helmet back on and went over the side, Samuel working the pump. The bubbles marked his descent, marked their vulnerability. For the next 10 minutes, they'd be divided, distracted, exposed. The riders saw it too. They dismounted, spreading out, using their horses for cover, not attacking yet, but positioning, testing. "You've got a choice," Hutchins called out. "You can ride away now, go file whatever claim you want in Leadville. Let lawyers sort it out, or you can try to take this by force and find out that my father's son learned a few things about fighting for what's right." Big talk from a businessman with hired hands. "These aren't hired hands," Hutchins said. "They're partners, men with a stake in seeing this through, men who'll stand when it matters. Can you say the same about whoever you brought with you?" That scored. Jedidiah saw one of the other riders shift uncomfortably. Hired guns were loyal until the bullets started flying. Then they remembered they weren't being paid enough to die for someone else's gold. The bubbles below intensified. Frank was working hard, racing against time and cold. Metal rang against metal, the sound carrying up through the water. Almost there, almost done. "Last chance," Jedidiah said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "Ride away, live to argue in court, or stay and find out how serious old men get when you threaten what's theirs." The leader's hand moved toward his gun. Jedidiah's rifle came up in the same instant, smooth as breathing. Across the clearing, Samuel and Hutchins raised their weapons, 4 rifles against 3 pistols at distance. The mathematics had gotten even worse. The leader's hand stopped, hovered, then slowly moved away from his holster. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Hutchins agreed. "It'll be over in court, where it should be. You want to fight there, we'll fight there. But the days of settling this with guns ended when my father died." The three riders mounted and turned their horses. They didn't leave quickly, that would have been admitting defeat too clearly, but they left. Jedidiah kept his rifle up until they disappeared back down the trail. 3 tugs on the rope. "Pull me up." They hauled Frank to the surface. When they got the helmet off, he was grinning despite the cold. "Got it," he gasped. "The door's off. The safe is open." They pulled up the first canvas bag 20 minutes later. It was heavy enough that 2 men were needed to lift it onto the platform. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived 3 decades underwater, were stacks of gold double eagles. $20 pieces, each one stamped with the date 1874, each one perfect. They pulled up 6 more bags over the next hour. $22,000 in gold, exactly as Captain Hutchins' log had documented. The treasury payment that had cost a good man his life and had waited 30 years to be recovered. But there was one more thing to bring up. As the sun touched the western peaks, they lowered Frank down one final time. This time he came back with a burden wrapped in canvas, the mortal remains of Captain William Hutchins, finally coming home from his long vigil beneath the water. Leonard Hutchins wept openly as they laid his father's body gently on the shore. Calhoun the parrot sat quietly nearby, his duty finally, completely done. 3 months later, Jedidiah stood in the small cemetery outside Leadville, watching as they dedicated the new headstone. It was fine marble, expensive, with words carved deep enough to last centuries. Captain William Hutchins, 1829 to 1875. He kept his word. Leonard Hutchins stood beside him, looking more at peace than Jedidiah had ever seen him. The legal proceedings had been mercifully swift. The Treasury had verified the serial numbers on the gold, confirmed the loss reports from 1875, and declared the salvage legitimate. They'd let Hutchins and Jedidiah keep 20% as finder's fee, $4,000 each. More money than Jedidiah had seen in his entire life. But more valuable than the money had been the story. Newspapers across Colorado had printed Captain Hutchins' final log entries. The tale of a man who'd died protecting his cargo, who'd chosen honor over survival, had struck a chord with readers. William Hutchins had become, posthumously, a hero. His sacrifice had meant something. His son could finally be proud instead of ashamed. "Thank you," Leonard said quietly, "for all of it, for the log, for helping recover him, for doing this right." "Your father earned better than what he got," Jedidiah replied. "Seemed only fair to give it to him, even if it took 3 decades. They stood in comfortable silence, 2 men who'd started as adversaries and ended as something close to friends. The Colorado autumn was painting the mountains in gold and red, the same colors Calhoun wore. The parrot was back at Jedidiah's small cabin, content in his warm retirement, occasionally muttering his old phrases, but mostly just enjoying sunflower seeds and companionship. "What will you do?" Leonard asked. "With your share?" Jedidiah had thought about that question a lot over the past months. Tom Patterson's getting old. Ranch will need buying when he's ready to sell. Thought I might put my money toward that. Spend my last years working land that's mine, making decisions that matter. Maybe take on a few hands. Give young men the kind of steady work Patterson gave me. "That's good," Leonard said. "Good use of it." "And you?" Leonard smiled. "Funny thing about spending 30 years chasing something, when you finally catch it, you realize the chase was what gave your life shape. Without it, I'm just a man with money and no purpose." He paused. "I'm thinking of funding an expedition to document other wrecks from the flood. There are probably dozens of them, scattered through these mountains, stories waiting to be told, history waiting to be recovered. Your father would approve of that." I think he would. They left the cemetery together, walking back toward town. Jedidiah was staying at the hotel tonight, his first time sleeping in a real bed in weeks. Tomorrow he'd ride back to Patterson's ranch, back to work, back to the life he'd been living before a Parrot's Cries had changed everything. But he wasn't the same man who'd camped at Crystal Lake 3 months ago. Something had shifted in him. He'd always thought of himself as someone who lived small, who took what life gave and didn't ask for more. But finding that wreck, fighting for what was right, finishing what Captain Hutchins had started, it had reminded him that even quiet men could do things that mattered. Even old cowboys could be part of stories worth telling. That evening, he sat on the hotel's porch with a good whiskey, the expensive kind he never bought himself, and watched the sun set over the mountains. Somewhere up there, Crystal Lake was freezing over for winter. The sunrise rested on its bottom, empty now, but somehow more complete. Its cargo had been delivered, 30 years late. Its captain had been brought home. The bird that had guarded it all could finally rest. A familiar voice spoke behind him. "Mind if I join you?" Leonard Hutchins settled into the adjacent chair with his own whiskey. For a while, they just sat there, 2 men watching light fade from the day. "I was thinking," Leonard said eventually, "about that other thing, the thing we didn't talk about." Jedidiah knew what he meant. Briggs' grandson and his companions had filed their claim in court. As threatened, it had been dismissed immediately. They had no standing, no documentation, nothing but a history of theft to support them. But men like that didn't give up easily. They nursed grudges. They waited for opportunities. "Figured they might try again," Jedidiah said. "Eventually, they won't." Leonard's voice was quiet but certain. "I had a conversation with them. A financial conversation. Sometimes money solves what bullets can't. They're leaving Colorado, starting fresh somewhere else, with enough stake to make an honest life, if they choose to." Jedidiah looked at him with new respect. "That was generous. That was smart," Leonard corrected. "My father died because men were willing to kill for gold. I've got gold now. Last thing I want is to repeat his story. Better to break the cycle, even if it costs me. Your father would definitely approve of that." They finished their whiskey as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new days to live through. But tonight was for sitting still, for feeling grateful, for acknowledging that sometimes stories ended the way they should, not with easy happiness, but with honest closure and hard-won peace. Jedidiah thought about Calhoun, sleeping warm and safe in his cabin, thought about Captain Hutchins, resting at last under that marble stone, thought about Leonard, who'd spent half his life searching and could finally stop, thought about himself, a quiet man who'd found something loud and important. The gold had been real, but the real treasure, he was starting to understand, had been the chance to help finish an unfinished story, to honor a promise kept across 3 decades, to prove that some things mattered more than money, things like loyalty, honor, and keeping your word, even when it cost everything. Sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries did come from sounds that didn't belong, from cries that persisted when they should have faded, from birds that refused to forget. And sometimes, if you were lucky and brave enough to listen, those sounds led you exactly where you needed to go.